We're so excited to have you with us. My name is Bill Danaher, and I'm the rector of Christ Church Cranbrook. We are delighted to have you for an incredibly important webinar. I'm delighted to have with us Dr. Stephen Taylor, who has recently written an incredibly important book called The Psychology of Pandemics. He is the author of more than 300 peer-reviewed publications. And Dr. Taylor researches anxiety disorders, in particular obsessive compulsive behavior and post-traumatic stress disorder. His recent work on the psychological effects of pandemics has been covered in The Independent and the New York Times. With Dr. Taylor is Dr. Stephen Huprick. Dr. Huprick is author of more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and author or editor of 6 professional texts. He is the immediate past president of the International Society for the Study of Personality Disorders, and he is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and of the Society for Personality Assessment. In addition to his research and academic work, he has 21 years of clinical practice. And then we have Dr. Julie Brakazuski, who is a clinical psychologist and director of Monarch Behavioral Health in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. She's an expert in individual therapeutic treatment, as well as community level services and a psychological assessment and testing and other interventions. She's published and presented works in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, national conferences, and she is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Thank you all for joining us. We are so excited to have you with us. And I'm really grateful to my panelists, as well as to Dr. Taylor for being with us with an incredibly important presentation. What I'd like to do is just give you all an orientation, those of you who are coming online, as to how to manage this new technology, which is bedeviling us a little bit tonight, maybe because of so much use. But over to the right of your screen, you have a chat feature, which you can provide some feedback. And I also know that many of you are still trying to get online because of the incredible popularity of this topic. We'll be monitoring that chat, but we won't be able to do a lot of work to answer or interact with you on that chat. But that chat is still a good way to get in touch with Meredith Skowronski, who's going to be serving as our kind of host and manager of this discussion. At the bottom of your screen, you're going to see 2 little blurbs, and they'll say Q&A, and those that's where you'll be able to provide us with some feedback, and the Q&A pops up, and there's a chance for you to write a question there, and we'll start to approach those towards the end of the webinar. So other than that, I think I'd like to do 2 things as you're getting on. One is to make you aware that we have a resource sheet that's going to have some self-management techniques, and we're also going to have some further resources for you to consult for caregivers and for both local and national groups that can provide you the assistance you have. We're going to send that to you by email after the conference ends. We also going to send it to you both in PDF form and in Word form so that you can make any adjustments that you want to. We've considered this a resource that you can all use as best you see fit within the many spheres that you inhabit. I also want to take a moment as we get ourselves situated to offer a prayer in silence for all those who are affected by this pandemic. And many of us who are in Detroit know that this pandemic has been taking down some very, very public people in Detroit, and it's been a very challenging time for us in Metro Detroit to deal with this. So just before I go into that prayer, I'm just getting some feedback that there's still a little bit of technical issues with my microphone. Is that still the case? Okay, I'm going to just keep going. Let's take a moment and just feel place our feet flat on the floor and feel the back of our chairs with our back. And let's go into a posture of prayer and silent reflection. And let us give thanks for this opportunity for us to learn and to get to know the challenges and psychological dynamics around pandemics. Let us also take a moment to lift up to God all those who are suffering from this pandemic, for those who are sick and dying, for the families that are mourning them, for the incredible work that our healthcare providers are doing for them and the heroic work they're doing, and for the many people who are caring for the sick during this time, who are constantly putting themselves at risk as they care for those who are vulnerable. And let us pray for all those who have been economically affected by this pandemic, who have lost their jobs and are seeking employment, who are experiencing food insecurity, who are lonely and isolated as a result of social distancing. And let us ask that God be with them as well and enable us to be ministers to them as best we can in this time. And let's lift up all of the spiritual and psychological first responders to this pandemic, to the psychologists and counselors and pastors who are spending so much of their time and energy and resources, personal and otherwise, to minister and to guide and to therapeutically work with people who have been affected by COVID-19, for the challenges that they're facing with their technology, for the work that they're trying to do to carry on their therapeutic work in the midst of some difficulty, for the balance that they have to maintain with their home life as well as their work life. Let's lift all those people up as well. And finally, let's lift up all the people who have signed up for this seminar tonight. We are so grateful that we have this opportunity to learn from new research that came out just in time, that we can deepen our knowledge of what we're contending with, and also that we can grow in our own self-knowledge and self-understanding as we seek to help others manage this pandemic in different ways. All of these things we place in God's hands, and we ask that God would be present where we cannot be, and that God would help us be present where we can be during this time, and that God would give us the wisdom as we read elsewhere and pray elsewhere to know the difference between our own limitations and our own challenges and our own powerlessness and the things that we can do. Amen. So it is a delight to have Stephen Taylor with us, and to just give you a little bit of background about his work. Dr. Taylor wrote The Psychology of Pandemics. It was published in October 2019, and I'm completely amazed that you had the foresight to know somehow that this book would be incredibly relevant. And so the first question I want to ask Dr. Taylor is, how did you find your way to this research topic, and how did you find your way to writing this book?
Well, my background is in anxiety disorders. That's what I specialize in, including health anxiety, and that is people who worry excessively about their health. And that's my clinical work and my research. And a couple of years ago, I kept coming across news reports, interviews with virologists predicting that there would be another pandemic. And I started reading about it out of curiosity, actually. And the more I read into it, the more I realized that pandemics weren't just some virus spreading throughout the globe. They were, in important ways, psychological phenomena in which what people do or choose not to do influence whether infection is spread or contained. If people choose not to wash their hands or choose not to social distance, that influences the spread of disease. And importantly, pandemics, psychology was important because people's emotional reactions are important too. We've seen this recently with panic buying, for example. So the more I read about it, the more I thought, wow, psychology is really important here, but no one had ever put it all together into a single book. So I had to bring together various pieces, various subdisciplines of psychology, epidemiology, virology, medical anthropology, history of medicine, to bring it all together, to put it together into a coherent whole. Funny thing enough, in July last year, I took it to my editor who publishes some of my books. And I said, look, I've got this cool idea, psychology of pandemics. He looked at it and said, no one's going to read that. And he rejected it. I was really deflated by that. So I went and found another publisher, and we got it published a few weeks before COVID-19 broke out. I knew another pandemic was coming because it had been predicted for a long time. I just didn't know it would be coming so soon.
One of the things that an important point that you make in your book that I find so powerful is that the psychological footprint of a pandemic is greater than its medical or even economic footprint. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what I mean by footprint here is the number of people affected by it. Just to give you an example, we've got some research ongoing. We've currently got data on about 3,500 people. There are people from the communities from the United States and Canada, asking them about how they're impacted by the pandemic. Many of them are very anxious. Many of them are lonely and stressed in social isolation. Some are experiencing financial difficulties. About a third are experiencing financial difficulties. 27% are hoarding. And yet you ask them whether they know anyone who has COVID-19. Only 1% know someone, and about 1% have been diagnosed with COVID-19 or probable COVID-19. So the actual incidence of COVID-19 among these people is very, very low, 1%. And yet many of them, a third or more, are impacted in some financial or emotional or stress-related way.
And so in some sense, it's not just the kind of psychological responses, the hoarding, and it seems like it's a broad spectrum of responses that get triggered by a pandemic, that in terms of numbers, there's fear, there's anxiety, there's PTSD, as you've written.
Yeah. And those emotional reactions change over time. I'll give you an example. Someone I know, he was what we call an under-responder. He was denying that this pandemic was a big deal. He thought he doesn't need to socially distance. He thinks the media has exaggerated it all. Then yesterday, he learned that one of his good friends passed away from COVID-19 in New York, and that completely turned him around. Now he's very, very anxious. He's socially distancing. He's washing his hands. So yeah, that's an example of some of the extreme reactions you see. And we're still seeing this today, where some people are underplaying the whole thing. They're not socially distancing. They're partying on the beaches. They're not washing their hands. And they're the people who spread infection to other people. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are highly anxious and highly worried about getting infected.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing, because one of the things you mentioned in your book is that for many people, they have a kind of resiliency even under the conditions of a pandemic. But there are others for whom maladaptive behaviors and other kind of psychological maladies start to kind of be exacerbated by the pandemic, and it's connected not only by proximity, but also by just how they respond to the sense of what's happening.
Exactly. So research on previous disasters and pandemics shows that most people are highly resilient, that we as a species have survived countless pandemics in the past, and people will survive this one, although many will be distressed or financially hurting during it, but we will get through it, but not everyone will. A minority, and nobody knows how many at this point, will have psychological problems. Some may have long-lasting psychological problems, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And they're often people who have pre-existing emotional problems too.
It's funny, it just as anecdotal, and I'm going to make sure that we do have opportunities for our panelists to come in, but we're doing a survey of our congregation, and we have about 2,000 members. And we decided in our survey to begin with the oldest members, because we thought they would be the ones that would be facing the most difficult times psychologically. So everybody over 80 has been connected, and we've contacted them one way or another to just do a wellness check by phone. And without exception, they are doing psychologically incredibly well. In fact, they're kind of pointing us to others, saying, there are other people that are suffering. We're fine. We're going to get through this. And from my perspective, I wonder if that's a little bit of Detroit pride. The city as a whole has been through kind of so many rises and falls that they've kind of seen this before, as it were. But it's a stunning thing, and I've been trying to think about it psychologically. Is that are these? I mean, of course, we know people in their 80s who suffer from psychological maladies, but is there a kind of thinning of the herd that happens? Like when people who are resilient, they somehow live this longer and they're able to handle things better and they have more perspective.
That may be, you may well be right there. And people who have been through adversity and survived it, they can get toughened up emotionally, so they're better able to deal with stresses. And if these people are plugged into their community, so they're members of your congregation, they're getting contacted, they have social support, that can go a long way toward helping them. So that's wonderful that your seniors are doing well. Not everyone, unfortunately, does so well. There was some research on SARS in Hong Kong, and about the time SARS broke out, there was a spike, a fourfold increase in suicides among seniors. And they were people who were lonely, socially isolated, some were medically frail. They were frightened of becoming a burden on their families. So that we don't know whether this will happen with COVID-19. We hope it doesn't. SARS and COVID are different in some important ways, but we need to make sure we do reach out to the senior members of our communities to make sure that they're, as you say, a check-in to see how they're doing.
And I would add to that I know our senior population, and perhaps being connected in with the congregation mitigates this a little bit, but that they're at the highest risk for social isolation before a pandemic. So to be experiencing that social isolation and food insecurity, that it really ups the ante once everybody is on social distancing protocol. That certainly really increases risk for that depression and anxiety and further social withdrawal. I mean, even if they have means to do video chat or phone calls. So certainly, putting that into action, knowing that that data from the SARS epidemic, understanding how we can use that to really be reaching out to our seniors, I think is important. So it's great that 80 and up, you've already initiated that, but I think as individuals, we can also think, who can I be reaching out to, kind of writing a letter to see if they need supplies or need a through a window interaction, how can we lift up our community and those that are at highest risk?
This discussion reminds me of back at 9/11 and the reactions we all had to 9/11. And I was talking with a lot of people in my peer group at the time, and I was 30 something at that point. But I remember talking with dear friends who actually introduced my wife and me. And they had grown up in World War II and, were retired. and very well connected and integrated into the community. But they were the most calm and resilient of it all. They had lived a long life, they had seen a lot, and they recognized that you know, there is a resiliency in people and in societies and in cultures that will persist. And I always found that to be very reassuring. So I think there's certainly a lesson to be learned, you know, from those who have lived a good life and a long life and who've been resilient. But as Julie is suggesting, I do think we have to be mindful of the fact that not everyone is in, you know, such a situation, and the risk factors you described, I think, are very relevant.
Well, and I want to be clear that there's the database that I'm mentioning is incredibly selective and doesn't represent everybody as a whole. And you know, the by and large, the seniors who are members of our congregation have been economically privileged. They have many different connections, so they don't feel things as closely as many others in our communities. And so but I do think it's important that resiliency also gets lifted up, as you were noticing in your book. It's a key thing, but also to recognize all of these major issues that people are facing. I want to move on to a really interesting part of your book, which is not merely to speak about the therapeutic treatment or interventions that we can make or the screening we can do to help people who are experiencing fear, anxiety, PTSD, or other kinds of neurotic behavior. But you make the interesting point that psychological factors influence the spreading of emotional stress and infection. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we've seen this already. We saw the rise of racism when the outbreak arose, and unfortunately that is fairly common during past pandemics. When people get threatened by a disease coming from an outside source, they look for someone to blame. They became xenophobic, particularly the people who are frightened of infection. So obviously that's very socially disruptive. We saw a spike in anxiety when the World Health Organization declared this a pandemic. And then we also saw panic buying, where people were told to go and stock up. And so everyone went to the supermarket with a common goal, and inevitably someone who's very anxious will overpurchase. And images of overstuffed shopping carts and empty aisles went viral, and then the whole thing snowballed. People became frightened of missing out on supplies, so panic buying happened. Other psychologically important factors we've seen are, in some places anyway, the rush of the worried well into hospital. If you look at the symptoms of COVID-19, the symptoms are fairly non-specific. And most people, and this is on our survey anyway, that most people think that they're flu symptoms or cold symptoms. Some people think that a runny nose is an indication of COVID-19, which it's not. So these people are misinterpreting. I can understand why that would happen. COVID-19 is in the top of everyone's mind. And suddenly you have the sniffles, you misinterpret it. Oh, maybe I've got COVID-19. I better go to hospital. So you've got this surge of the worried well into hospital that's overwhelming the healthcare resources. So that's another important psychological phenomenon. And then, of course, we've got the whole issue concerning the stress and impact of social distancing, of people choosing not to socially distance, which again makes it difficult to control the spread of infection.
Yeah, I want to get to social distancing in a moment because it's really a key and complex phenomenon psychologically, as well as a tactic to try to stop pandemics, which has been, and it really is one of the major ways you do it. But what's interesting to me as well is what you wrote is about the whole concept of the psychology of super spreaders. And those are people who find their ways into many different communities. They are chronic carriers of a disease, but they have mild symptoms or are asymptomatic, and they kind of go through and they keep spreading it to people, which is, I think, it seems like that is a major factor in COVID-19.
It may turn out to be, because people can be contagious but asymptomatic or have minimal symptoms. And we saw a case in Europe recently where one fellow infected 18 other people because he didn't realize he was infected. And that's happened in SARS too, quite dramatically, where people have gone on to infect dozens of other people because they were shedding virus but weren't aware that they were sick. So we don't know how big of a problem it will be with COVID-19, but we are seeing it already.
Yeah, I mean, and the example that you gave in your book that I find is historically what many people do when they study epidemiology is Mary Mallon, who was a cook in New York City in the early 20th century, who had typhoid and continued to, but was asymptomatic and just carried it to several different households and different places. She was went so far. She was forbidden to do so. She did not respect any of the authority of science or the government, and went so far as to change her identity and change her work. She's an example, an extreme example. But I'm wondering if not that I want to encourage you to do any kind of psychological profiling across the centuries, but is there a kind of profile for a super spreader?
I'm not aware of any single profile. I think some of these people are, well, by definition, they come into contact with lots of people. So if they're in the hospitality industry, if they're highly gregarious, then they're going to be more likely to spread. But I'm not aware of any single psychological profile. Mary Mallon's case was tragic. It's tragic for everyone involved. She wanted to be a cook. That was her calling in life. And she was shedding virus. I think she bacteria. She was infected with tuberculosis, so she infected another 50 people. She was in denial. She denied that there was anything wrong with her. She just wanted to be a cook. And she would go from household to household, but she sort of knew she was spreading infection because she would move into a house to serve as a cook, then everyone would get sick with tuberculosis, and then she would have to move on to another place. So in the back of her mind, she knew that she was carrying the infection, but just didn't want to admit it to herself. And the sad thing for her was that she was involuntarily incarcerated in a sanitarium because she wouldn't refrain from working as a cook. She was incarcerated, and then she was released with the understanding that she wouldn't work in the food service industry. She promptly disappeared, changed her name, and started working at a maternity hospital where she got lots of young women sick, and then was returned to the sanitarium. Very tragic. It makes me wonder, would there be a more humane outcome for someone like her? Could she have gotten a job somewhere else, or would she have agreed to that?
Yeah, I mean, I find her case interesting because in many ways, as an Irish immigrant with basically domestic skills, Mary Mallon did not have other options before her to do besides, starving, and her decision to survive, in a sense, probably overrode any kind of recognition of the impact of her actions. I view her more sympathetically as in retrospect than maybe that she's been sometimes portrayed. In one of her statements that she made to a reporter at one point, as you mentioned in your book, she said that she felt like she was being banished like a leper. For carrying for carrying the disease, and not to rush things, but that does speak a little bit about the tendency to stigmatize not only the people who are carriers of a disease like COVID-19, but also whole groups because of their association with it. Maybe because of the name, like Spanish flu or SARS or something like that.
You're absolutely right. And part of the problem was a lot was not known about tuberculosis back then. They thought the infection was located in her gallbladder and wanted to remove her gallbladder. So the doctors didn't know how to manage the disease either at the time. And so it was a tragic situation where her options were limited. But you're right, it does raise the important issue of stigma. And it's just too easy to jump on that bandwagon and blame outsiders for your own problems. And this happened during SARS as well, where healthcare workers were stigmatized in their own communities. They were shunned and avoided because people in the community were frightened that the healthcare workers were carrying SARS. Even the children of healthcare workers were discriminated against. They were in some cases being told to take their kids out of kindergarten because people were frightened. Now, I really hope we don't see this during COVID-19. And I am encouraged that people seem to be stepping up and supporting our healthcare workers. Here in Vancouver, for example, for the past week at 7 p.m. every night, people go out onto their balconies and start cheering. And they're cheering for the healthcare workers. That's what they're doing. I think that's wonderful.
That is such an incredible, what a wonderful thing to do, and what a lovely thing to do. Wow, that's beautiful. You know, to look at it from the other side, you know, not only do psychological factors affect the emotional stress and the spread of the disease, but you also cover the fact that psychological factors affect how people respond to the disease and to the pandemic, and how they treat, for example, the risk communication about what's happening to them, and all sorts of different factors play a role in how they read that information. There's also the tendency to fall prey to quack cures and folk remedies, and then to engage, as you've been saying, particularly this case, in just kind of incredibly curious hoarding, like toilet paper. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, it was interesting. If it wasn't toilet paper, it would have been something else. I mean, someone was shamed in Vancouver recently for hoarding frozen meat. He went into a grocery store and bought all the meat he could stuff into his shopping cart, hoarded that, and images of that went viral. I think what happened with toilet paper, people were stocking up on necessities, and toilet paper is very, very distinctive. If you've got a shopping cart, you can see whether it's stacked with toilet paper. So it was distinctive, and there were those images that went viral of people overstocking in toilet paper, and that's why that got stuck in. One reason why that got stuck in people's minds.
And then also the whole idea of quack cures. I've had perfectly reasonable people send me messages on Facebook telling me that lemon juice has some kind of is some kind of reasonable way to combat infection by COVID-19. I don't think this has much life, but I'm just telling you, it came to me. Yes.
Yeah. I haven't heard the lemon juice one. I heard the garlic one and turmeric. That people desperate to make themselves feel safe are going to turn to just about anything. Now, part of this is trying to get a sense of control. We deal with stress better if we feel like we have a sense of control. And with COVID-19, we're told that this special threatening thing is coming, that we don't need to wear masks, that all we should do is wash our hands and socially isolate. And for a lot of people, that's not enough, and they want to try and make themselves feel safe. Now, I don't mind if people go out and pursue quack cures, so long as they're not harming themselves. There have been some cases recently of people overdosing on chloroquine, which was, it's a malaria drug, but it's also used to clean fish tanks, to kill parasites in fish tanks. There was a case recently where a man died because he took those chloroquine pills from his fish tank thinking it would keep him safe.
My goodness.
Misinformation had got out that this was a magic bullet for COVID-19, which it's not. And there have been other overdoses too. So people need to be really careful if they're pursuing treatments or remedies with no good scientific evidence behind them. It could be doing themselves more harm than good.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, certainly the fear certainly does drive that, but there's a lot of psychological vulnerabilities too. Pre-existing psychopathology, other kinds of stress that's going on, you know, personality characteristics, traits. And so, you know, I think some of those behaviors can be explained in very different ways. Some of the more malicious ones that, you know, I've seen are, you know, some religious leaders claiming to have, you know, a cure and trying to get their congregation to buy something, and actually states have shut them down. That's a more extreme example, but it kind of goes to show that there's a number of different kind of factors that kind of contribute to that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think also it's good to acknowledge that we have a set of kind of cognitive biases that get us through the day, that help us kind of function normally. But then when an unexpected or new novel situation comes around, we're still operating on those, how we kind of interact with the environment and assess risk. And one of the things that we do, for instance, I know you'll probably talk about this later, but we check social media, we listen to the news to get information, and then we become biased in terms of how likely it is that we will actually be impacted by this, and then we seek control, certainly, and then we tend to seek things that create a zero risk, because even when individuals know that something is unlikely, they will go and try and do something where they feel like they have no risk to compensate for that anxiety. There have been tons and tons of research studies really inventively conducted that are really interesting, how we as humans tend to make the error to choose something that has zero risk over something that quite honestly makes sense, or we might even benefit from. So when we're thinking about managing the anxiety around this, and there really are just a few key things that you can do to keep you and your loved ones safe. And then it's like hard stop, lemon juice ain't gonna do it. Salt water ain't gonna do it. Fish tank cleaner ain't gonna do it. So there's some really simple things that we have to follow, but it doesn't feel like it lowers the risk enough for people when their anxiety is so high.
In this to pick up on what that both of these perspectives are kind of raising, is you develop in your research two kind of basic stances towards the risk communication that happens during a pandemic. There are people who are monitors, and there are people who are constantly trying to respond to the slightest indication, who are checking their temperature night and day, and have a kind of perceived vulnerability to disease that is feeding them and making them miserable. And then you have blunters who kind of see through. And one thing that I'm interested to know is you speak more about those is, both of these would seem to be fairly vulnerable to conspiracy theories about COVID-19, which seems to be a major issue.
That's an interesting question. The monitors, the people who seek out lots of information, tend to have a really poor tolerance for uncertainty. They want certainty. As Julie was talking about, they want to reduce their risk to zero. They're the people who tend to chronically worry. And unfortunately for them, we're in an infodemic with COVID-19. The social media and news media are saturated with stories. So they're getting a lot of information, including misinformation and including sensational social media images and videos, which is ramping up their anxiety. So for those people, the question is, do they buy into conspiracy theories? I think the conspiracy theory mentality is a little different. If you believe that COVID-19 was a bioweapon, and that's one conspiracy theory, if you believe one conspiracy theory, you're likely to believe another. So people who buy into the COVID-19 bioweapon conspiracy theory also tend to believe that NASA faked the moon landings, that 9/11 was an inside job, that JFK was assassinated by the mafia. So it's this kind of paranoid conspiratorial mentality with the idea that they think they know better than everyone else. So they're the conspiracy theories. They might not necessarily be monitors or blunters, though.
And see that, and the question that I find fascinating, which you mentioned in this, is that the way you actually get through to both monitors and blunters is by actually doing good, clear, transparent communication. Because monitors respond well to fear mongering. If someone says, "My God, don't you, wash your hands, sitting is the new smoking," all of this kind of thing, you'll get it immediately because you're just you're so focused. But blunters will just the more emotional an appeal is, the more a blunter will ignore it. They're an interesting psychological profile, and this actually makes them prone to kind of be held captive by conspiracy theorists, because people say anti-vaccination people tend to generate these incredibly, one would say, Catholic views of the world, in which they even list, the arguments against, against not getting someone vaccinated. And they actually show a kind of openness, whereas the people who are defending vaccination tend to become more and more shrill and forced into kind of stating their position. My God, you've got to be vaccinated. You're putting everybody at danger. And so it's an interesting psychological problem that arises in the context of pandemics.
It's fascinating and super complicated. And some of the findings are counterintuitive. You would think that people who are anxious about their health would get vaccinated, but it's the opposite. If you see yourself as highly vulnerable to disease, you're less likely to get vaccinated. And from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense, because a vaccine, it's new on the scene evolutionarily, and it involves puncturing your skin and injecting a pathogen into your body. So some people who are highly anxious about getting infected won't get vaccinated. In fact, in our research, we look at it so far, we asked people, if we get a vaccine, will you get vaccinated? 20% of them said no. And part of that is the uncertainty about the vaccine. Yeah, but that's going to be one of the big challenges up ahead for us.
I want to start, before we continue to go through some of the things that we've discussed to cover in this webinar, I want to actually interject a couple of questions that have come our way from the people who are watching it. Reverend Sharon Cox writes the following. She says, I serve a small congregation in a rural conservative area. My folks are pretty independent and self-reliant and continue to tell me they are doing fine. What signs should clergy become aware of so that would indicate that our parishioners are not coping well with this pandemic, with the biggest challenge being that we are limited to phone communication with my parishioners right now?
That's a challenging issue. I guess there's nothing better than knowing your parishioners, or knowing these people. If you see behavior that seems out of the usual, if you have someone who's always turned up to meetings, who was always outgoing and gregarious, and suddenly you just don't see them anymore, or you don't hear from them, then that would be a warning sign. But it's very difficult to figure out how people are coping without information. So we need to know what's going on. I suppose some people that you would worry about would be the people who have a history of emotional problems. Some of those people would be worth reaching out to specifically. But if you've got people who are pretty independent and self-reliant, I would expect that most of them would be doing well. In some ways, this pandemic can be regarded as Christmas time for survivalists, because they're already prepared and they've been waiting, and so they're not going to know exactly what to do. So I would expect that those people would not be as anxious as, say, the unprepared people who go out flying.
Yeah, I was just thinking too, to that specific question, that if your parishioners are getting more isolated and maybe detaching even further, kind of, perhaps more convinced that their perspective is right when there's other evidence to suggest things are getting worse, I would certainly think of that as a warning sign, and perhaps want to reach out even further to check on them.
And I think oftentimes our community leaders and clergy are the front line to mental health intervention. You guys see it first and then provide an avenue for resources. So when speaking to people, asking, what are you doing every day now that everybody's on lockdown, and getting a sense for, are they keeping daily routines? Are they functioning within their home? Do they have a project, or are they able to work during this lockdown? When's the last time they spoke with family or friends? Are they able to get creative and do some sort of social interaction? And if people are seeming kind of withdrawn or confused, or again, like you said, retreating into some really kind of more severe thinking patterns, absolutely, those are warning signs that somebody's not coping with this as well as we would love them to.
One of the things that you have, Dr. Taylor, in your book that we're going to send, we got permission from the publisher to send this excerpt, is Dr. Taylor has compiled from different sources some recommendations regarding stress in a pandemic. And it's basically a checklist that we're going to email to you, all of you who have signed up for this tomorrow. And it's a very rough and ready screening procedure. And by that I mean it's a way that you can do a kind of diagnostic of your congregation and of yourself about how you are developing your resilience, how are you planning, how are you communicating about this with your children, how are you connecting, and then also a really, really key part of this is when to seek help. You know, if you are beginning to experience persistent anxiety, worry, insomnia, irritability, and depression, or avoiding social contacts, if you're really obsessing, you know, about your bodily functions and whether or not you've come down with COVID-19, you know, and my example is, you know, oh my gosh, I've got blood on my toothbrush. I must be completely ridden with it. You know, I mean, that's the classic kind of thing. And then if you're engaging in, you know, some just deep fear about your environment. And then finally, and this is, I think, this is the one that probably hits close to home with almost everybody, if you're abusing alcohol or drugs or overeating as a way to cope with the stress. And I find what Dr. Taylor's done by gathering that all together to be an incredibly important resource to share with your congregations. And at the same time, what, you know, from my perspective, I would simply ask your parishioners, if they happen to live with somebody else, to give that sheet to someone else and then have them kind of look at them and give them some feedback, because we're not very good at diagnosing ourselves when we come across these things. Well, I'm not drinking too much, or isn't this allowed? You know, sometimes I'm under stress. And then we also have on this sheet, you know, some way in which you can pick up on these warning signs. And there's a whole list that Dr. Julie has given us of not only reliable resources for the coronavirus, but also local services in Metro Detroit, and also places to get if any of your congregation is struggling with food insecurity, they can get some food and some support in other ways, and then also some wider national resources for you that are websites that you can go and begin to arm yourself a little bit as you're dealing with this. And so I really appreciate all three of you for helping with this fact sheet, because I think it's going to be a rough and ready way. Another thing that's in this fact sheet that I want to mention is we also have some criteria for healthcare workers. Because one of the things that Dr. Taylor notices in his book is that healthcare workers often don't care for themselves in the midst of this of pandemics. Can you say a little bit more about that, Doctor?
Yeah, this is enormously important, because if we lose our healthcare workers, it's going to make it so difficult to manage severe cases of COVID-19. There are a whole bunch of stresses that are fairly unique to healthcare workers in this context. One of the stresses is going to be they need the resources to do their job. They need beds, they need ventilators, they need diagnostic tests. So they're the practical things. If they don't have those, they're going to be experiencing some degree of distress. Healthcare workers that work with COVID-19 patients, they're under social isolation pretty much 24/7, because they're at work, they're isolated. They come home, they're not supposed to interact with family members because they could be infected. So that's enormously stressful too. So they need support from upper level management. Peer support's important, where people can get together and support groups. And of course, it's important for them to take some time and de-stress in the ways that they normally might do that, whether it's some kind of physical activity or what have you. And importantly, they need to watch out for self-defeating or harmful coping behaviors that make matters worse in the long run. And you mentioned overeating and alcohol. It's funny, here in Vancouver, we had panic buying of alcohol and cannabis because marijuana is legal here, right? It's sold by the government. So people were flocking to the government-run marijuana stores and buying up all the cannabis they can and alcohol. And you can imagine that that can create further problems too if people aren't coping very well and substance use disorders are spiking. I also wonder about internet shopping, because that's something people do when they're bored too. So you're stuck at home, you're in lockdown, you're experiencing financial difficulties because you can't work, and then you just decide to cope with that by shopping. Not a good idea. So we need to watch out for maladaptive coping behaviors. And one of the other warning signs that people should also look for that you're not doing well is reactions by your friends and family. If your friends and family are saying, hey, you seem not your usual self, you seem more irritable than usual, then that's an important piece of information that you need to get a handle on your stress.
Yeah, another pastor has written in, and I think it's a really important question, which is that, what's unique about this, the situation with social distancing, is that she has to provide pastoral care for people when she herself is experiencing the very same stress and trauma. And so we're paying a very high price for social distancing. And it's not just an economic price, it's also the ways in which people maintain their identity, their social identity, their personal identity, their personal integrity is through these networks that we are now unable to do except through technology.
Mm.
And many of our positive coping behaviors have just kind of been like the rug swept out underneath us, because they involve connecting with other people in person or going places, being out in public. And I know we haven't talked a lot about kids yet, and we will get there, but certainly for kids, their entire routine has been disrupted. And oftentimes during those times when all of those routines are out the window, the normal coping behaviors have kind of been snatched away, that's when a lot of maladaptive coping happens. And for adolescents and adults, I think circling back around to the substance use issue just for 2 seconds, that people often have the impression that, oh, I'm just going to drink a glass of wine, and then a week later it turns into a bottle of wine a night, or smoke a bit. People think that will alleviate anxiety, but I think it's really important and good to say really clearly that we know depressants such as alcohol and other substances lead to an increase in depression and anxiety. So you might feel okay when you're altered, either drunk or high, but then the flip side of that, your brain can't produce the happy chemicals that you need to keep going with an okay mood and managing your anxiety. So to put that out there for ourselves and for loved ones, to be able to have that conversation that we're definitely at risk for increasing substance use right now, as people are kind of shut in and don't know what else to do to pass their time or want to use it as a coping strategy. But it's kind of good to have that information on board.
Can you say a little bit? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, you go ahead, because I know that this is of interest. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think this might be a good point to talk a little bit about personality and how that's related to this pandemic. Because much of what I do in my academic life is more in the area of personality and personality pathology. And I think there's really 3 areas or 3 parts of personality that we need to think about and understand when it comes to managing the pandemic. So the first thing that I like to talk about, or I think about, is what I would call are the needs that we have that are due to maintaining ourself, and the needs that we have for relationships. And it's very important, for us to function and to live a life that's meaningful. We want to feel that we have a lot of agency, we have autonomy, we've figured out how things work, it's predictable. We can go and do our activity, take a trip somewhere, go somewhere, and we know what to expect. And the same is true with the people around us. We have a predictability, and that helps us get more autonomous. It helps us feel agentic, like we can complete the things we want to do. But we also have affiliation needs or relational needs, and we talked a lot about that tonight with the social distancing. But it's so critical for us, to maintain relationships and to have a healthy network of support and people around us. But you think about this pandemic, the self needs and the relational needs are getting upset in tremendous ways. Our autonomy is limited. We aren't able to be as agentic as we want to be. In fact, we're faced with new challenges that make us question our agency altogether. So it really leads into quite a challenge in terms of how we think about ourselves. The same is true relationally. You know, we're isolated now. You know, a lot of us have become more dependent upon technology to connect, but a number of people aren't comfortable with that. And so they find themselves really struggling. So that's one area. Another area that has really taken off and is very relevant in scientific study of personality right now are what we think of as our trait domains. All of us have personality traits, and it's become pretty clear that these traits are organized into 5 broad ways of functioning. One of those areas, in a more healthy end, we might call it like neuroticism or lower neuroticism. At more extreme or pathological levels, it's high neuroticism, or as our DSM is now proposing, we call it high and negative emotionality. People who are higher in this trait are already viewing themselves in the world in a way that's full of anxiety, fear, stress, tension. So that's going to predispose one to problems with coping. Detachment is another trait. Obviously, if we can, connect with other people, even if we're more introverted, if we can at least feel like we are connected, that helps. But if we get more and more disconnected and are detached, that sets us up for problems. And certainly this pandemic is making it very easy to be detached. Disinhibition is another one of those traits. So the more impulsive we are, the more problems that causes. And certainly in a time of crisis, you don't want to behave impulsively, because then you can make bad decisions. Antagonism is another one of these traits. And so if we tend to be pressing against people and against the world, it sets us up for problems. But you think about a pandemic, oh my gosh, I've got to get my groceries, my toilet paper, whatever. It can set us up for problems. And then the last trait domain is what is known as psychoticism. In the healthier expression of that, in language coming out of more like the study of normal or typical personality, we call it openness. And people have a degree of openness to experience. They can think outside the box. They can try new things. But at more pathological manifestations, they look, starts to look more psychotic. They're out of touch with reality and they don't function well. If someone already is high on that trait dimension, and now the world is just seeming to fall apart, and intensifies and magnifies that trait and that trait expression. The last area, and then I'll stop for others to comment, but we've talked a lot about it already, but as a personality psychologist, we think a lot about our defense mechanisms or our coping. We've talked a lot about substance abuse, but I think one of the things that I would want to highlight right now is that this is a really abnormal time, and it is normal not to be coping so well. I think
that's a beautiful point.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I have an anecdote to tell about this. So I had a phone call on Sunday evening from the Human Resources Department at the university where I work. And they said, we have reason to believe you've been exposed to somebody who has COVID-19. And so I got off the phone and I was like, oh gosh, am I going to be isolated? What happens if I get sick? I went to my wife and I said, we never did sign, we updated our will and our documents. I said, we never signed that. And then I had to kind of stop myself and say, look, I've been isolated already. I'm doing the right things. I feel fine. Most of the COVID cases, you don't get real severe symptoms. Some people do, we know that. But, I had to kind of get a reality check. Fortunately, the next day I found out I was only exposed in a 2-hour block at a meeting from 2 weeks earlier. So I was already out of the critical period. But I share that personal example because, I got pretty anxious there for a moment. And it's normal to get anxious and it's normal to regress. So I think a take-home point from that is we need to be gentle and kind with ourselves and with each other. And we're finding in the ways that we have our defenses are coping, some people want to take more control and manage, more of that kind of autonomy part. Some people do that well. Sometimes they hold on too tight and it makes them more anxious. Other people move away from that and get more dysregulated. And they have to be kind of managed because they're feeling extreme. But I would just want to add that, that we have to appreciate that this is such unusual circumstances, and we're all going to regress. We're all going to look a little unlike ourselves at times.
I think that is so important. I want to open this up into another question for you all to bat around a bit, because what I hear you saying and what I think is something that can help us with this is basically that right now, because it is so out of whack, one of the most important things we can do is practice some self-compassion, because what's happening, all of the resources that we have on this checklist, which are incredibly important, and all of the pathologies that are going to be stirred up inside of us, if we're normal, we're not going to be adapting well. Those take a while to address, even in the best therapeutic circumstances, right? I mean, if I call Dr. Julie and say, oh my God, I'm just having this incredible anxiety right now, it's going to take, she could be Sigmund Freud, but, it's going to take a while to kind of get me back onto my place. And maybe self-compassion is the most important thing we can do. And that picks up on a question that Judith Schellheimer, who's a chaplain at Hillsdale College, is writing. And she said that, give us what kind of key kind of tools can we use when we see those who we love who are feeling panic, lack of focus, inability to sleep, etc., that comes with this pandemic? What are some of the rough and readies that someone could use?
I think I think a couple of things in terms of the panic, helping people, one, just labeling it. It seems like you're feeling really panicked, because people will have intense emotion and then it feels disorienting. And then you don't know which way to point, because we're kind of, as humans, prepackaged in that our emotions come with a biological component that is motivation that then turns into behavior. But if we don't really recognize how we're feeling, we don't know what to do with that motivation, and that often turns into negative coping strategies. So helping people really reflecting and being sympathetic and empathic and helping them realize I am feeling really anxious, and we can relate that to our own feelings. I've had a tension headache like 4 nights in a row over here for sure, because my muscles are so tight. Just managing everything and everyone and homeschooling, that's a disaster. And coming into the office to see people via video. So relating ourselves, being empathic and helping label that. And then also increasing perceptions of control. So that's what we're seeking, and really souping up that, are you washing your hands? Are you socially good? You're doing it. You're doing exactly what you need to do. Now, how do we get you socially connected to others? Or another kind of piece of coping with this is contribution. Are there ways, do you have things in your home that you can help? I know lots of families are coming up with different ideas, like making blankets for shelter dogs, finding a way to contribute while you're kind of stuck at home, so that you feel, or writing notes to people in your neighborhood and putting it on the window, so that they know that you're thinking about them. Ways to contribute to connection without being closer than 10 feet away from people. And then for sleep, just real fast and quick, separating your sleep habitat from your day habitat. So do not look at screens, do not read, do not work in your bed. You want to keep your bedroom, if it's at all possible, for sleep only, because that's hitting something right on the head there, that maintaining our biological rhythms when we are totally out of whack with our routines is paramount. So if we can keep our sleep schedule on schedule, you're actually doing pretty good, better than a lot of people. So helping people keep their sleep regimen and hygiene on is important.
I was just going to underscore two of your points because everything you're saying is great. You know, one, just sort of that need to, when people get activated like that, just to be able to validate that experience and show you recognize that. I mean, we know out of developmental psychology and attachment research that how we come to know ourselves is so dependent upon the mirroring and the recognition of the other in terms of what your inner state is. And so there is such a calming effect and a capacity to organize oneself when you have some reflection there. And it sounds so simple, but it's terribly important. But then the other thing is just maintaining that kind of schedule on a day-to-day basis. You know, I've talked to a lot of people this week who are struggling. And, you know, to the extent that you can keep that schedule that you've had, wake up at the same time, keep your activities. You know, I have one person who talked about her employer wants everybody to be available, you know, kind of round the clock because everybody's working different schedules. And I thought, well, you know, that's not really a particularly good idea. We should try to keep things as they are, work within those time frames, because that's going to help you contain, again, it goes back to that sense of agency yourself. You need to have that kind of control.
I want to shift to Dr. Julie's questions around families and family care, and you know, those interventions of doing something for shelter dogs. And this actually is something that Dr. Taylor picks up on when he was trying to find ways to kind of crack the nut of the blunters, you know, getting them to actually get on board with something. What I hear you saying there is that acts of altruism can actually help. So it's not just, you know, playing Monopoly until you die as a family, or you just are reduced to tears and fighting with games. But it's actually there's an altruistic element to your stuff. Can you say more about that?
Well, you know, it's partly based on our need to do something, as Stephen was saying, that sense of agency, that we've got something where there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of uncontrollability. If we can do things, it's not only benefiting us personally because we feel more in control, it's benefiting our community. And all of those little acts can be really important. We had one example in our building. A grade school student had written up a little poster thanking the couriers, put it on the window of the building. Thank you, couriers, for delivering our stuff. And those little acts of kindness are important. But as people have been saying, it's important. Self-compassion is really important at these times. We need to remind ourselves maybe that this is new territory for all of us. There's only one living survivor of the Spanish flu. You know, none of us have gone through anything like this. Although we need to remind ourselves, of course, we need to put it in perspective. This will end, but it is new and disorienting, and we can expect to experience some distress. And you mentioned family members fighting with each other. We should plan to cope with that. We should have that discussion in the household early on when everyone is calm. What are we going to do when we get on each other's nerves? So a strategy, a plan, so how they'll deal with that. So,
Dr. Julie, what kind of plans have you done? Not that I want to put any pressure on you, but this is your area of expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of circling back to what Stephen said about how we kind of understand ourselves is through our attachment and relationship, oftentimes with significant caregivers and of course parents. And so kiddos look to, I'm assuming there aren't many kids watching, to us as adults, to how do they orient to the situation and how do they cope? And we often call, when we're talking about family processes and coping with anxiety in the house, we often call anxiety the red sock, because it's as contagious as a virus in the household. Like if you put a red sock in your laundry with all the whitewash, it all turns pink. Some of it rubs off. And so in our household, one of the main ways that we can manage family interactions is managing our own anxiety. And also a really big thing is monitoring our news intake. So we haven't really gotten around to talking about this, but this is part of the family process. Turn off the TV. It is not helpful to have the TV on background, not for adults and certainly not for kids. What kids often need are really direct facts, and then let them ask questions, because they'll tell you by their asking questions what developmental level they're at. And if you can label your own anxiety because we all have it. It's a human trait. We all experience anxiety. If you're able to label it and say, my stomach feels upset today, I'm worried about doing this meeting over video chat, I'm going to go take a walk for 30 minutes. Do you want to come with me? If we can label the emotion, label how it feels in our body, and then direct it in a positive coping trajectory, that models for our kids, and things are less likely to escalate in the household. And certainly having those discussions early on about with kids that are kind of late elementary to middle school and high school, being able to say, when we get on each other's nerves, what are we going to ask for? I'm going to ask to go for a walk. You might ask to have a little extra video game time that night. We might choose as parents to respond to kids in a more empathic and gentle way during this period than we normally would. If our kid was having a rip-roaring tantrum, oftentimes we would just be like, nope, and walk away. But in this circumstance, because kids are looking for us to cope and structure their regulation, we might sit next to them quietly. We might kind of put our arm around them in a way that we might usually walk away from that storm. But right now, kids will likely increase their need for affiliation, for snuggles, for wrestling. Lots of attachment behaviors are going to come out. You're going to see lots and lots. My own 5-year-old, I can't eat a meal without her on me right now. And she is just not that kid. So kids respond in also really surprising ways. Kids orient themselves to their structure in their daily lives and their routines. And that is all one day, pretty much 2 Fridays ago. That happened in one day. We just woke up and said, you're not going to go to school for about somewhere between 3, 5, 8 weeks. And it's really ambiguous, and they don't know when they're going to see their friends. Their whole day is mapped out in this routine. And now that's gone. And many parents are really struggling to provide that routine and scheduling. So part of not leading to escalation, the communication about what do each of us need when we start to feel irritated. And often circling back to Stephen again, oftentimes that's personality based. And you are the expert on your kid. So you know their personality, what they might need most. And then having those extra time for snuggles and physical activity. So helping them structure their day. I've seen a lot of really amazing schedules online on Facebook and Instagram, and they're like by the hour. It is incredible. If parents can do this, oh my gosh, I don't know how they could. So just having like an AM block and a PM block and writing 1 or 2 things in there, you're nailing it. That's amazing. So to be able even just to have that loose structure and making sure that there is a big chunk of exercise in there will help everybody regulate themselves in the household. Absolutely. And the more you label and model what you're doing and make it really apparent for the whole household, everybody else will follow suit too. So you have a lot of power and control in how this evolves in your household. And so keeping together while social distancing, it's going to be great for some families, and certainly some families that are already stressed or low on resources. It's going to bring out more difficulties. And so I also want to make sure we get across the message that providers are still out there. I'm seeing people every day on video chat, and I think, so Stephen, and so providers are out there and they're waiting for you to call, because now is a time where we talked about alcohol and substance use, anxiety, depression. The longer we're socially isolated, the more we're at risk for depression. That's how humans are. So reach out. There are lots of resources. Don't go it alone. And this is extraordinary circumstances. So even just having a 15-minute conversation with a professional around, my kids are climbing on the walls, help me brainstorm. It might be worth it during this time to keep everybody sane and together and get on the other side of this, because it will end. We will look back on this and say, wow, wasn't that extraordinary? But for this brief period of time, you might need some extra support. Don't hesitate.
I really like, just to pick up on one of the many good things you said in that, for me, to change the repertoire in which you're interacting with your children. And I think that to underscore one thing you said is the kind of inverse mirroring. If your child just kind of goes off like a Roman candle, you actually step in and just drop your voice to the exact measure that the voice is being raised, at least in my family, that was just seen as like just a bizarre and crazy event that happened. Like everything got calm right at that moment, and it was really quite hopeful because it kind of brought things different. So changing the repertoire in which you're parenting is probably necessary in this time. And again, so many parents are trying to balance the work they're doing, and they're now homeschooling, and they're now doing all sorts of things to keep the family going in a way that they never have before. I want to make a shift. We're amazingly, we're at 8:17. We still have 142 people listening, so grateful to all of you. I want to go and ask a couple more questions from the floor. One of them is that is what should we expect to see in the coming weeks as this progresses further psychologically? What is going to happen as we move forward?
That's going to be really difficult to predict. That depends on what our leaders decide to do in terms of managing this pandemic, whether they decide to end the social distancing and get people back to work, or whether they decide to draw this out. We do know that the longer we have the social distancing in place, the greater the chances of problems like depression that Julie pointed out, and also non-adherence to social distancing. People are going to get stressed and bored, and they're not going to adhere to it. So that's a concern. But it really depends on what our leaders do and the nature of the pandemic itself. I mean, the Spanish flu came in waves where people experienced one wave, it ended, they all breathed a sigh of relief, went back on their daily lives, and then were hit by a second, even more lethal wave. So we don't know if that will happen here or not. So there's that uncertainty as well. So who knows? Anyone's guess. There's just so many variables at play. It's just very difficult to predict where this is going to lead.
Yeah, I think my concern is really over the social distancing and the isolation. And for those who already are struggling with that, I think this is going to really intensify the experience. But, even for those who are pretty well connected, I think the internet connections are nice, but people are going to be longing for more, and want to see each other in person. And I think we're going to have to think, carefully about that. And, because I think you're right, Stephen. I think people are going to stop isolating. I think they're going to get together. They're saying, we've been fine. We've been isolated for 7 weeks, 8 weeks. We're good. And that's, we know that still doesn't prevent the risk.
And just to say that there's some of you who are raising your hands, and I want to say that if you can actually go to the right of your where you see participants, and if you put in Q&A, you can actually ask a question we'll raise to the panelists. And to pick up on that, Martha Whitaker has an incredible question, which is we've been talking about, as Dr. Brakazuski says so beautifully, kiddos, but her concern is about teenagers and adolescents who are not fully mentally mature and are having an incredible experience of denial, because so many of the important rituals around their progression in life, their graduation or their sports season, all of these things are being kind of taken away from them, and there's a lot of resentment. And Dr. Taylor, in your book, you talk about people who have kind of an unrealistic optimism bias, is the term you use. The people who think that they're not going to be approached. And I guess the question that Martha is asking is, what do we do when you have people without completely fully formed prefrontal cortexes interacting with their environment, a little bit like the spring break kids on the beach, which actually is behavior that happened all over the globe. Adolescents were completely disregarding the social distancing.
Well, it's a case, it's a case where someone has to play mum or dad, and in this case, the government stepped in to regulate social distancing. And that happened in Vancouver too. The sun came out and all these young kids went to the park. And if you look at the public opinion polls, they don't see COVID-19 as a big deal. They don't see themselves being at risk in terms of their own health. They're more stressed about finances in some cases, or graduating from school or not being to hook up with their friends, and they cope with that stress by getting out there and socializing with one another. So I think there are no easy answers to this problem, but it's been dealt with by clamping down on people getting together in groups, clarifying what social distancing means. And that's an important thing, because a lot of people don't understand what social distancing is. Many people think it's okay to have a dinner party so long as it's at home. That is not social distancing. So right. Public education is an important factor. And who knows, it might help if we educate people about the unrealistic optimism bias, but I doubt it. I talked about my friend earlier on who had this bias, and his bias was shattered when one of his personal friends died of COVID-19. Sadly, that might be what has to happen in some cases, that their illusion of invulnerability does get shattered when they see that their partying led to their grandparents getting infected, things like that.
And I think that we can use that to personalize middle school, high schoolers, an understanding, because certainly, yeah, that prefrontal cortex development through the early 20s is really important in helping us step outside of ourselves to consider other perspectives. And that invincibility bias that adolescents experience is real. That's why adolescents are known for doing dumb stuff because they aren't assessing the risks. It's not that they are just superhuman and agile. They're not assessing the risk fully. So to personalize it, and this is where that balancing comes in, because for some adolescents and also early 20-year-olds still going out to a lot of bars and I know in Detroit, there are these speakeasy clubs that people are setting up to still go out at night and to help identify in your life. And sometimes you can draw like a web, almost like a network, who in your life is at high risk for developing symptoms, being hospitalized, and perhaps, ultimately dying, and bringing it in a little bit closer to home that there are real people in our lives who we are social distancing. Our symptoms might be mild and we would weather this, but we love and know people who are at risk, and drawing them as a node, and then a couple people around them, and then a close family member or friend, and then the people around them. So making it real of who are you putting at risk. These are real people who you've had real experiences with, who you might really love, and making it more real that way. I think also turning the your choice to stay in is a superhero move. Your choice to actually stay in, and you might be bored, you might feel angry, you are missing out on a lot, and that really sucks. But you staying in is a superhero move. You're quite literally, you could be saving somebody that you might come in contact with your friend Sarah, and it might infect her grandmother. You don't know who you're infecting. And so staying in is a benevolent move. And sometimes we can really rely and evaluate our own family values and speak from that direction. In this family, these are the things we do. And so during this unstable time where things are really unpredictable, we're still going to live these values. And here's the actions that we're going to take on a daily basis to live those values, even in this circumstance. So there's a sense of family identity, self-identity, and more realism, and hopefully kind of shaking out of that egocentric view of an adolescent.
I think it's a really, really important insight, Doctor, because I think that one of the things that Dr. Taylor has in his book is that you can, and it's a term that having lived in Canada for 6 years, I understand the appeal of it, which is to create herd immunity is what is called when a population is able to ward off new viruses, because a large number of that herd, of that population has protection against it, and he came up with a slogan called "Join the Herd." Create that herd immunity, and again, that's another. It's really that values have to kind of somehow lead this discussion, and I might add also, just it's one of the comments that has come through from the panelists is that it found that Stephen and I touched our face more often than you Stephen Taylor, and Dr. Julie. So I assure you folks, I am basically in self-isolation completely. I'm going home after this. I came across to the church. I'm going to wash my hands, go back home across to my church, to my home. So, but I take your point to the person who raised that. I think I think that as we're moving towards the end, and I do want to, there's a couple of people who have raised some really important things for us to think about. In that, what is the psychic and psychological after effects of this pandemic? What are we going to be dealing with? What will psychologists be dealing with? What will counselors be dealing with? What will pastors be dealing with? What will even human resources be dealing with after this pandemic for the next 5 years or so at least?
That's the big uncertainty, isn't it? Some people will cruise through this experience and they will be fine. They'll get back on their cruise ships and go on cruises. For other people, they might have lingering psychological problems like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. For people who lost their jobs or their marriages or their mortgages or houses as a result of the financial impact of COVID-19, they could be facing some serious emotional consequences in the aftermath. For those who lost loved ones, that's important. For other people, the impact might be more subtle. They might have a different outlook on life, that suddenly it's no longer appealing to use paper money or to touch real magazines, that some people might be a little more reluctant to leave the house. That's really hard to say. One of the things that makes this so complicated is this pandemic is occurring in the context of climate change too. So we will be experiencing an increasing number of other sorts of disasters, including wildfires and floods and so forth. So maybe COVID-19 provides us with a training ground to practice coping skills for dealing with the uncertainties that are coming up in the future.
I think it's a hard question to answer. The first thing that came to mind for me, though, was I think we're going to be more resilient, because we will have gone through this and we will have witnessed a very difficult, out of the ordinary time. And yet I think there will be a coming together, to the extent that it's comparable, I think again about 9/11. And there was a real coming together and sense of community weeks and months after that. This is quite a bit different in some ways, but we do know that people are very resilient, and I fully expect that to be part of most people's psyche.
We're going to move towards a close with this, but I do have a couple of further questions, and before I get to them, I want to do just a shameless plug for our future programming in this. We're so grateful that all of you have been able to join us tonight. Next Wednesday at 7 p.m., we're going to have Bishop Bonnie Perry, who is the recently consecrated bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Michigan. And she's going to be talking a little bit about leadership in a time of pandemic and what she's, and her also is giving her an opportunity to kind of speak about the kind of work that she's doing in the community and her hopes and dreams and her work there. And then on the 15th of April, we are going to have an incredible opportunity for us to meet with John Barry, who's written a book called The Great Influenza. It's one of the great histories of pandemics. And he's going to be with us for a similar conversation about this, and to offer us some ideas of the history. What does history teach us about the pandemics we're facing? So the final question that we have for tonight, I'm going to kind of bring together a few questions that have been asked. One is that, one of the benefits of this experience has been that people have been actually reconnecting in ways that they never have. It's been amazing for me personally to see people who are not technologically skilled or adept, somehow finding ways to make connections over technology. And I do think that's going to change things in the future. We're going to get better at this. I mean, we're making our way through this webinar, and I didn't know much about Zoom less than a week ago. And to connect with that, what kind of hope and what kind of vision for the future that might be positive can you offer?
I agree with Stephen's comment that this is going to make us more resilient and bring us together closer as a community. We're using these opportunities to learn these, get more comfortable with these new tools, to come together. Now, I'm hopeful that those benefits will stick, that once the pandemic passes, our resilience and our sense of community will improve.
That's really wonderful. That's a wonderful way. And then, I want to thank you all for being part of this incredible presentation. We are gonna let you all go tonight, but why don't we? There have been questions that have been asked, and we're learning to do this. And I want you all to know how grateful we are that you all have been here and following this pandemic. I want to thank Dr. Taylor for taking time to be with us and to give us some for writing an incredibly important and relevant book on an intuition. Thank you for following that curiosity, and thank you for doing that kind of work. It gives me hope that the university can continue to be a place in the civic order that actually furthers the good and the true and the beautiful in real ways. Thank you to Stephen Huprick for his incredible insights and expertise in the area of personality, and for offering the important insights about self-compassion and pacing yourself. And thank you to Dr. Julie for giving us incredible insight into family dynamics and how to manage this in a way that we can actually emerge stronger from this and to develop new ways to live together. And then finally, I want to thank Meredith Skoronsky, who's been behind the scenes in making this possible. If we can, I want to just close with a quick prayer for everybody who is suffering and everybody who's been here and all of our concern. And so in our tradition, we say, the Lord be with you and also with you. Dear God, we thank you for this opportunity. We ask that you would bless all of those who work or watch or weep this night. Give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, heal the joyous, give rest to the weary, all for your name's sake. Amen.